Hi there. Welcome to the latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and helpful tips to develop your understanding and practice of public speaking. In the first part of a two-part series on researching your speech, we discussed the importance of thinking about researching support material in terms of locating evidence that you will use to support the claims you make in your speech. Therefore, we really want to emphasize locating high quality and credible sources of support material. The other thing we discussed in the first part was the all-important step of developing a research plan, the most important part of the process that most folks skip. We discussed why we need to establish specific objectives for the things we want to accomplish in our research activity, and then locating the sources and recording them as we go. So in the second part, we're going to look at what you do once you find these sources, evaluating the source credibility of your evidence, and then how do you use the evidence to put together arguments in your speech. Let's get started.
So we've got this sense of the research plan. The next thing that we want to think about is evaluating source credibility. As we mentioned before, you can find something on Google that sounds like it might be okay, and it turns out to be not so hot. So Frawley and Tuman talk about source credibility, a quality where a source can be reasonably trusted to be accurate and objective. This is very important because if your audience doesn't trust the support material as something that they can rely on in order to believe you, that's going to be a problem. And it's already going to be difficult if you present us with source information that doesn't have a documented source to begin with. So you need to provide us with a source in order for us to be informed or persuaded. And then you need to be able to establish for us that it's an accurate, objective source. So we want to think about the touchstone question here as a way to think about all of this. Who writes Wikipedia? Many students like to go to sources like Wikipedia, about.com, and other online encyclopedia sources that are written anonymously. Sometimes it's by experts, but sometimes it's just by professional writers that are doing amateur research. And sometimes, in the case of wikis like Wikipedia, it's written by any old buddy who just happens to get in there. While sometimes you can get good information from Wikipedia, and it might be a good place to just get some background knowledge that you can then take into a more serious research source, you have to ask yourself what kind of sources might be superior to Wikipedia in terms of your confidence and your audience's confidence in the material. So think about these tests. The four primary things you want to think about are expertise, objectivity, observational capacity, and recency. These are pretty easy to understand. The first test is expertise. How do you know if your source is an expert source? If that source has the possession of knowledge necessary to offer reliable facts or opinions about the topic in question. So for instance, on our previous search on information about video games, the first source that we found on a Google search was Wikipedia. Who wrote it? We don't know. What's the first source that we found using search and find at the MU library? Artha Asa Berger, a PhD and scholar in critical cultural studies of media. Which one do you know is most likely to have the possession of knowledge necessary to offer reliable facts or opinions about the topic in question? Berger wins, Wikipedia loses. The second test is objectivity. Presence of no bias, prejudice, or partisanship that would prevent the source from making an impartial judgment on your speech's topic. When we're talking about bias, we want to be careful not to confuse this with taking a position or a side on an issue. It's very possible to take a side on a controversial issue and still be objective. The thing that you want to think about is the source potentially prejudiced or potentially partisan and motivated through some sort of personal interest in you believing what they have to say? And that might lead them to skew their evidence in a sense that really isn't impartial. So for instance, with a Wikipedia source, who's writing it? You don't know. There could be folks that are contributing to the Wikipedia article that may have a personal agenda at stake in the way that they're framing how the information is presented in the entry. As opposed to if you go to something like an academic research journal, those sources tend to be much more objective because the sources go through what's called a process of peer review. In other words, before it gets published in an academic journal, Independent researchers look at the piece, it's blinded, which means they don't know who wrote it, and you've got 3 different people reading it carefully and making a judgment and a decision over whether or not it's worthy to be published. Usually they'll send the paper back to the original author. Here's some things you need to fix. You need to do some revisions. The author reviews it. Then the peer reviewers take another look at it. And then finally, if it's up to snuff, it gets published. That is a source that is objective, and that is a source that is vetted to be something that is unbiased, impartial, as well as highly qualified and reliable evidence. The third test is observational capacity. Observational capacity involves the ability of the source to witness a situation for him or herself. Again, who is writing Wikipedia? How do you know whether or not the person who updated this entry actually is in a position to look at this stuff themselves through study or research or what have you? Or maybe they're just doing what the person on that Smart Kids website was doing and just pulling together information from other, more expert sources who do have the observational capacity. So why not go to the expert sources in the first place? People who do research, or people who are eyewitnesses, good quality journalists who are on the scene or interviewing sources that were on the scene or involved in the issue and able to witness the situation for themselves. That's what observational capacity is. And if you don't know the source's capacity to be able to observe things themselves firsthand, not as great of a source. The final test is recency. This is a pretty simple test, but a pretty important one. Recency refers to timeliness relative to the subject matter in question. Depending on the topic you're talking about, whether or not a source was published this year, last year, or even 3 to 5 years ago, can really make a big difference in whether or not the information is still reliable and still trustworthy. This is especially true when we're thinking about topics that deal with science and technology, topics that deal with politics or current events, where things that are happening change day to day, week to week, month to month. So it's going to be important for you to think about your topic and ask yourself, how recently was this information discovered and published? Now again, one of the possible advantages of some internet sources like Wikipedia is that they can be updated constantly. And so if you really need cutting edge journalistic coverage of an event, for instance, going to high quality journalistic sources on the internet can be probably the best way to find out what's happening now, as opposed to academic journals or books, which take anywhere from months to years to get published. On the other hand, you want to be sure that whether it's a printed source or an internet source, it's going to be recent enough to not be outdated by some more recent source that would potentially change the way things are perceived. Now, with other kinds of sources, it is possible that the publication of the source could be a while back, even several years ago, and it still might be okay if what we're talking about is a more historical topic or other kinds of subject matter where the issues are rather timeless. If you are presenting a particular theorem in mathematics, for instance, some are being innovated and published every day. But there are some that are really important that have been around literally for thousands of years. And so the publication date on the source that provides you information about it, not as important. But you need to think about recency in terms of your topic choice. Okay, so once we've evaluated source credibility of the research references that we found, now we're at the stage where we want to be able to present the evidence in our speech. And so we want to make sure that we thoroughly document our sources. We want to make sure then that we present our evidence in claim, source, support order. In other words, you don't just want to spew out the fact or the quotation without telling us where it came from, and you also don't want to provide the evidence without telling us what point it's actually supporting. Take this example, for instance. Let's say I'm doing this research on the effects of video games, and I run across this study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. This, of course, is not the whole study. This is just the abstract, but it's about risk-glorifying video games and behavioral deviance. So when I'm reading the article, I find some points like this. This is what the study was about. We want to see if playing these kinds of games were associated with increases in alcohol use, cigarette smoking, aggression, delinquency, and risky sex, etc., etc. They look at the results. Among those who play these video games, it was associated with increases in all measures of behavioral deviance. And so when we get to the conclusions, the research supports the perspective that MMORG gameplay can have consequences for deviant behavior, broadly defined, etc., etc. So there's lots of information in the source, and you're going to be pulling information from the source to present in your speech. Now, does that mean you need to provide direct quotations from the source in order to support your points? Very possibly, especially if the wording is important or it's presented in a really clear way that helps you get the point across. Or it could be something as simple as this paraphrase. Recent research tells us that video game play is associated with greater risks for harmful behavior. A 2014 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that playing mature-rated, risk-glorifying games was related to increases in drinking, smoking, risky sex, and other forms of what they call deviant behavior. Now, this paraphrase captures accurately what's going on in the article. I don't necessarily have to use a direct quotation. But more importantly, look what I've done. First, I've presented, here is the point that I'm trying to make. Then I present, here's a source of research that is reliable and credible and high quality. And then I present you with the evidence itself and what the evidence says that supports my claim. This is the claim, source, evidence order that Frawley and Tuman are talking about. And this is a very simple but very effective way to put together a simple argument in your speech. So, if you document your sources and then present your evidence in claim, source, support order, the other key tips that they provide are to use evidence in a supporting role, which means essentially you're not really going to get into a cut and paste quilt. This is your speech. You need to provide the main ideas, and the argument is being driven by you. You don't just want to take a whole bunch of direct quotations and put them together with some transitions and call it a speech. That's a cut and paste quilt. That's not your speech. The evidence needs to serve your speech. You're not just providing a vessel for other people's words. So use evidence in a supporting role. And finally, as I just mentioned, paraphrase responsibly. What that means is you need to use the ideas that are found in the source in a way that both attributes that source. It is absolutely not okay to use somebody else's ideas and not provide that source documentation. That is plagiarism, and that is stealing, even if you don't mean to do it. The other thing that you need to do is make sure that you're using the words and ideas that come from the source in the spirit of the way that the author intended them to be used. Taking words out of context and stating that they mean something that the author really didn't intend them to mean is also a big violation of public speaking ethics. So you don't want to do that either. If you paraphrase responsibly, providing that documentation, this is a great way to make clear, simple presentation of evidence that backs up the points you want to make. So to sum up what we've learned in this two-part series on researching your speech, firstly, we need to think about the research process in terms of trying to locate high-quality evidence. What you're essentially looking for is information that you can use to support the claims that you want to make. And if you want to support the points that you want to make, you need to make sure that the evidence is high quality, which means that it's credible, it's reliable, and it's coming from a place of real knowledge. You can get that if you do a Google search, but you're also going to get a lot of shady stuff from a Google search too. And therefore, you may want to try to err on the side of going to the places where the high quality stuff is. We talked about developing a plan before you start the process. Don't just go to the databases and then sit there with the search box in front of your face and just start putting stuff in randomly. That's not going to help you, and it's actually going to make you feel more overwhelmed. Developing a research plan that starts with your objectives is the best way to go. Then, as you're finding your sources, really keep source credibility in mind. And because source credibility is so important, make sure you make smart use of the available resources at your disposal. If you've got access to a university library like we have at Mizzou, you've got reference librarians and a whole bunch of really helpful online resources, not just for finding evidence, but also for evaluating it. And your tuition dollars are paying for this stuff, so you might as well use it. And finally, As you're working, make sure that you document citation information and organize your research as you go. That way, when you finally get to the stage where you need to take your evidence and construct how you're going to present it in the speech, not only do you know that you're going to have evidence that will support your points, but you're also going to be able to communicate to your audience that because I know where this information comes from, I know that it's expert enough, I know that it's objective and unbiased, I know that it's got the observational capacity to know what's going on firsthand, and it's recent enough to not be outdated by other stuff. Okay, if you've got any questions about this research process, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.